She walked away without a word the first time he saw her. Tall, proud, unbowed by thirst or pain or the suspicion that had lived in her eyes for as long as she could remember. He gave her water. She gave him nothing in return. Not a smile, not a thank you, not even a backward glance. And somehow, that was the beginning of everything. If you watched the first part of this story, you know what happened next. 300 Apache warriors surrounding a lone rancher's valley. A test that lasted 6 days, a necklace placed on a table, and a choice that could not be taken back. He passed the test. He wore the necklace. He chose honor over safety, and peace over the approval of men who confused violence with strength. But that was only the beginning, because here is what no one tells you about the moment you choose to live differently. The world does not stop to applaud you. The army keeps moving through the northern pack. The militia keeps riding. The winter keeps coming, cold and indifferent to the decisions of men. And somewhere in the hills to the north, a young woman is riding back toward the valley she never quite stopped thinking about. Not because she needs water this time, because she needs something that doesn't have a word in her language or in his. What you are about to hear is the story of what grew in the silence between two people who had every reason to stay apart and chose, slowly and honestly, not to. It is the story of a man learning to read the land through someone else's eyes. It is the story of a woman who fell, literally, physically fell, during the most important test of her life, and discovered that what she learned on the ground was worth more than anything she would have learned standing. It is the story of a people whose culture is so deep and so alive that a man raised in a completely different world could sit at their fires for one winter and feel for the first time that he understood what home actually meant. And it is the story of a wedding, not the kind you have seen before. A wedding held under the open sky, because the Apache have always known that the most sacred things should not be enclosed in walls. A wedding where 4 mountain spirit dancers emerge from the darkness at the edge of the firelight, their painted bodies and towering crowns moving in patterns older than memory, blessing the ground where 2 lives are about to become something new. A wedding where 300 people form a circle, not as audience, but as witnesses, as the living proof that what is happening belongs to the world now and cannot be taken back. He was a man who came to the desert looking for silence. He found it. But silence, it turns out, is not empty. Silence is full of everything you haven't learned to hear yet. This is part 2 of Water and Honor. This is the story of what water becomes when it finds the place it was always meant to reach. Stay with us. Let it settle before the story begins.
Water and Honor. Part 2. The Language of the Land. A story of courage, culture, and a love born between 2 worlds. Part 1. The Winter Returns. 3 months had passed since Nizani and her people disappeared into the northern hills, and Corbin Thorne had almost convinced himself that life would return to something resembling normal. The valley was quiet. The militia had not come back. The necklace rested against his chest each morning when he woke, and each evening when he closed his eyes. And if he thought about the girl who had stood in his cabin and spoken of water and honor, well, a man could think about many things in the silence of the desert at night. The first snow came in November, unusual for that elevation, and thin, but enough to silence the valley in a way that felt different from the usual quiet. Corbin was mending a section of fence along the north boundary when he heard the horses. Not the anxious, scattered sound of men in a hurry. Something slower, deliberate. The sound of people who were not afraid of being heard. He straightened and turned. They came over the ridge in a long column. 30, maybe 40 people, moving in the careful, unhurried way of a community that had learned over centuries how to carry everything that mattered on horseback. Men rode at the front and flanks, rifles resting across their saddles, eyes scanning the landscape with quiet attention. Behind them came women on horseback, some carrying infants in cradle boards, carefully crafted wooden frames wrapped in soft buckskin, decorated with beadwork, the babies tucked inside like seeds held safe through winter. Children rode double with their mothers or trotted alongside on small, sure-footed ponies. At the center of the column, loaded pack horses carried the community's belongings. Rolled hides that would become shelters, clay pots wrapped in blankets, dried meat and corn stored in woven baskets, the tools and medicines and sacred objects of a people always ready to move. I recognized the painted horse before I recognized the rider. Nizoni rode near the front of the column, tall and unhurried, her dark braid catching the thin winter light. Beside her, on a black horse with a white blaze, rode the chief, her father, the man whose name Corbin still did not know and had never asked. They stopped at the edge of his land. No one spoke. The chief looked at Corbin across the space between them with those dark, unreadable eyes. Then he looked at the valley, the water, the sparse grass, the rock formations that offered wind shelter along the western edge. Nizani rode forward alone. "My people need to stay," she said when she reached him. No greeting, no preamble. Just the fact of it, stated plainly. "The army moves through the northern passes. They look for us. We need a place until the cold goes." Corbin looked past her at the column of people, at the children, at the cradle boards, at the old women sitting straight-backed on their horses with the patient dignity of people who had been moving their whole lives and would move again when they had to. "How long?" he asked. "Until the passes open." 2 months. Maybe 3. He was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed across the valley, cold and dry. He thought about the militia, about the sheriff in the nearest town who had already heard rumors about the rancher who wore Apache beadwork, about what it would mean to have 40 Apache people camped on his land for the better part of winter. Then he thought about the cradle boards. "The south pasture has the best wind shelter," he said. "There's a spring along the eastern edge that doesn't freeze. I'll show you." Nizani studied him for a long moment. Something moved in her eyes. Not surprise exactly, but something close to it. As if she had prepared herself for a different answer, and now had to adjust. "My father will want to speak with you tonight." "I'll be here," Corbin replied.
The Apache camp took shape with a speed and efficiency that left Corbin quietly astonished. Within 2 hours of arriving, the south pasture had become a living settlement. Teepees rose in a practiced arrangement, the openings facing east, toward the sunrise, as tradition required. Each structure was a careful piece of engineering, long poles forming a conical frame, buffalo and elk hides stretched and tied across them, the smoke hole at the top positioned to carry fire and heat upward while keeping the wind out. The hides had been tanned until they were supple and nearly waterproof, painted on the outside with symbols that told the story of the family inside. Horses, mountains, sun, stars, the geometric patterns that carried meaning across generations. The women did most of this work, moving with the coordinated ease of people who had done the same task hundreds of times. They spoke to each other in low voices, passing children between them, directing the older kids to carry poles and bundles, organizing the camp with the quiet authority of people who understood that survival depended on doing this well. The men set up a perimeter, not aggressive, not threatening, but present. They knew this land was not theirs. They also knew that strangers sometimes came without warning, and that warning was worth more than almost anything else when you had children to protect. Corbin watched from a respectful distance. He had his own work to do, extra water to draw, a section of his barn to open for the pack horses, his own food stores to assess. He had enough for the winter, barely if he was careful. With 40 people camped nearby, careful was going to mean something different. That evening, as the first fires lit in the camp and the smell of wood smoke drifted across the valley, he went to find the chief. Nizoni was outside her father's teepee, seated on a blanket, working on something in her hands. As Corbin approached, he saw what it was: a section of beadwork on a strip of leather, the tiny glass beads arranged in careful patterns of blue, white, and copper. Her fingers moved without hurry, threading the beads with a bone needle, her eyes half on the work and half on the darkening sky. "He's waiting," she said, without looking up. Inside the teepee, the chief sat beside a small fire. 2 elder men sat with him, old warriors, their faces mapped with decades of weather and decision. They looked at Corbin with the careful attention of men who took nothing for granted. The chief gestured to a place beside the fire. Corbin sat. What followed was not so much a conversation as an examination. The chief spoke in Apache, and Nizoni translated from just inside the entrance. He asked about the land, how long Corbin had been here, where the water came from, what grew and what didn't, where the army patrols moved. He asked about the militia, how many men, who led them, where they came from. He asked about the nearest town, the nearest fort, the roads between them. Corbin answered everything honestly. He had no reason to lie, and he suspected that the chief would know if he did. Toward the end of the evening, the chief said something that made the elder men nod slowly. Nizoni paused before translating, as if choosing the words carefully. "My father says you are a man who stays in one place," she said. "Most white men keep moving, always looking for the next thing, the better land, the more water. You stayed. He wants to know why." Corbin thought about it. "Because I found something worth staying for," he said finally. "Not the land, the quiet, the way this valley sits between the hills, the feeling that out here, a man's choices are his own." Nizoni translated. The chief listened, then spoke again. "He says that the Apache also stay where there is water and quiet and the freedom to choose. He says perhaps you understand more than he expected." It was, Corbin understood, the closest thing to a compliment the chief was likely to offer. He accepted it with a nod.
The weeks that followed were unlike anything Corbin had ever experienced. He had spent years living alone in the desert, believing that isolation was a kind of wisdom. He was beginning to understand that it had also been a kind of blindness. Every morning he woke to the sounds of a community, children calling to each other, women singing as they worked, the rhythmic sound of food being ground on stone metakes, the flat grinding stones that Apache women used to turn dried corn into meal, a sound as old as the desert itself. The smell of wood smoke and sage, and the particular sweet scent of yucca root being prepared for washing, drifted across the valley. He learned things without meaning to. He learned that Apache women were not merely the caretakers of the camp. They were its architects, its managers, its memory. The teepee belonged to the woman who built it. The decisions about where to camp, how to store food, how to manage resources through the winter, these were largely women's decisions, made with a practical authority that needed no announcement. An Apache husband moved into his wife's family's camp. The line of descent ran through the mother. The grandmothers were the keepers of knowledge. He learned that the Apache relationship with the land was not the relationship of an owner to a possession. It was the relationship of a member to a community. The land was alive. The water had spirit. The mountains were not obstacles or resources. They were presences, beings with their own nature that deserved respect and attention. When Apache hunters took a deer, they spoke to it. When women gathered plants, they left some behind. Not out of policy, but out of genuine understanding that the plant community needed to sustain itself. He watched children being taught and understood that Apache education happened everywhere, all the time. A small boy following his uncle learned to read the ground, which tracks were fresh, which animals had passed in the night, what the bent grass said about the direction of movement. A girl helping her grandmother learned not just the practical skill of tanning hide, but the stories woven into the work, why they used certain plants, what the symbols meant, who had taught whom going back 7 generations. And through all of it, Nizoni moved. She was not the chief's pampered daughter. She was his second, his translator, his emissary to the world outside the camp. She knew things that most of the warriors didn't.
She spoke English and a working knowledge of Spanish she had picked up at trading posts, and she could read the signs of white settlement, the survey markers, the fence lines, the patterns of army movement in ways that most of her people could not. She also came to the well every morning. It started practically. The camp's spring was reliable but slow, and with 40 people needing water, Corbin's well, deep, cold, and fast, was the more efficient source. He would draw the first buckets before dawn, and by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, Dejoni would arrive with 2 clay jars balanced across the back of her horse. They didn't talk much at first. She would fill the jars, load them onto the horse, and go. He would watch her leave and return to his own work. But the silence between them was changing, becoming less the silence of strangers and more the silence of 2 people who had run out of reasons to pretend they weren't paying attention to each other. One morning, she arrived to find him struggling with the well rope. A section had frayed and he was trying to splice it one-handed, his other hand gripping the bucket handle to keep it from falling. Without a word, she dismounted, took the rope from him, and began to work. Her hands were quick and confident. In 2 minutes, the splice was done. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "Everything breaks," she said, handing the rope back. "So you learn to fix everything." She began filling the jars. He watched her work. "The beadwork you were doing the other night," he said. "What does the pattern mean?" She glanced at him. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she set down the jar and looked at the necklace visible at his collar. "You see the blue beads? Blue is the south, warmth, growing things. The white is the east, the morning, the beginning." She traced the pattern in the air with one finger, not touching him. Together they mean a person who faces the morning and brings warmth, someone you would want beside you. He looked at the necklace, then at her. "Someone you would want beside you," he repeated. "It is what my father said when he made it," she said. Her voice was perfectly neutral. "He said it when he gave it to you." She picked up the jar and loaded it onto her horse without looking at him, but as she mounted, the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something better than a smile, because it was not performed. He stood at the well long after she was gone, the morning light spreading across the valley, the necklace warm against his chest.
On the evenings when the cold was bearable and the wind had settled, the Apache community gathered around a central fire. Corbin began attending these gatherings, at first awkwardly, aware of being an outsider, sitting at the edge of the firelight. But no one asked him to leave, and gradually the edge of the circle became simply his place, the same way a man's chair at his own table becomes his place over years of use. The evenings were built around stories. This was something deep in Apache culture, the oral tradition that carried history, law, medicine, and values across generations without a single written word. The storytellers were the elders, and they spoke with the unhurried precision of people who understood that words, once spoken into the dark, do not easily disappear. Dejoni would sit near Corbin on these evenings and translate in a low voice, not every word, but the shape and meaning of what was being said. He heard the story of Changing Woman, the sacred figure at the heart of Apache spirituality, a being who was born from the union of the sun and the earth, who never aged but cycled through the seasons like the land itself, young in spring and ancient in winter, and young again the following year. She was not a distant deity, but a present one, the power that moved through young Apache women as they came of age, the force that connected every woman to the origin of the world. He heard the story of the mountain spirits, the Gone, powerful beings who lived inside the sacred mountains and emerged to teach the Apache how to heal, how to fight, how to live in balance with the land. The crown dancers, he learned, did not merely represent the Gone during ceremony, they became them. The masks and wooden crowns and painted bodies were a doorway through which the spirits entered the world to bless and protect. He heard the story of how the Apache came to the Southwest, the long migration from the far north following game and water, and something less definable, a pull toward a particular landscape that became home not by decree, but by recognition. The canyon lands, the desert mountains, the dry rivers that ran with water in the monsoon season and slept the rest of the year. This was the world the Apache had shaped themselves to fit over centuries. And he heard one evening a story he had not expected. An old woman spoke, one of the grandmothers, her face creased and her eyes sharp, her voice quiet but carrying clearly across the firelight. Nizoni listened for a long time before she began to translate, and when she did, her voice was careful. "She is telling the story of a man from the north who came to live among the people long ago," Nizoni murmured. "He was not Apache. He came from a different world. He didn't speak the language, he didn't know the customs, but he learned. He learned to be quiet when silence was required. He learned to take only what he needed from the land. He learned to give back what he received. And in time, the people said he had become something that didn't have a word in his own language. Not Apache, not what he was before, something new." Corbin was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Sparks rose into the cold, dark sky. "What happened to him?" he asked. Nizoni listened to the old woman's final words. A smile moved across her face, small and private. "She says he stayed," she said. "That is the whole story. He stayed."
In the 4th week of the Apache stay, something happened that Corbin had never seen and would never fully find words for. He woke before dawn to the sound of drumming, a deep, steady pulse that seemed to come from the earth itself rather than from the camp. He dressed quickly and went outside. The valley was still dark, the stars sharp and cold overhead. The fires in the camp were bright, and around them, the entire community was gathered. He walked to the edge of the camp and stood where he could see without intruding. One of the older warriors, a man he'd seen before but never spoken to, stepped out of the firelight and spoke to him briefly in Apache, gesturing for him to come closer. Nizoni appeared at his elbow. "One of the children is sick, a fever that has lasted 4 days. My father called for the Gan." "The mountain spirits?" "Yes." She looked at the fire. "Tonight they come." What Corbin witnessed in the hours that followed was something that existed entirely outside the world he'd been raised in, outside the whitewashed churches and the rational certainties of the world he'd left behind. 4 dancers emerged from the darkness at the edge of the camp, their bodies painted in intricate patterns of black and white and red, wearing hooded masks topped with tall, elaborately constructed wooden crowns decorated with mirrors that caught the firelight and threw it back in fragments. They moved with a precision that was not quite like any human movement Corbin had ever seen, controlled and deliberate, carrying wooden sticks in both hands that they clicked together in a rhythm that wove through the drumming. They were not performing. That was the thing that struck him most. Every ceremony he had ever attended in the world he came from had the quality of performance. People doing things because they were supposed to, in the right order, for the right audience. This was different. The dancers were not doing something. Something was doing them, or through them. He didn't have a framework for what he was watching, but he understood, standing there in the cold with the firelight on his face, that this was real in a way that many things he had called real were not. The sick child was a boy of about 4 years, held by his mother near the fire. The Gan dancers moved around him in patterns that seemed to follow no obvious logic, but felt somehow precise, as if the movements were cutting channels in the air through which something could flow. The medicine man sang, his voice low and steady. The community sang with him. The drumming held everything together. The ceremony lasted until dawn. By the time the sun rose over the eastern ridge, the boy's fever had broken. Corbin didn't know what to do with that. He stood at the edge of the camp as the community came slowly to rest, the fires burning down, the dancers disappearing, the medicine man sitting quietly with his eyes closed, and tried to understand what he had witnessed. He went to the well and drew up a bucket of water, and stood there holding it, looking at the valley in the early light. Nijoli came to him after a while. She looked tired, the way everyone in the camp looked tired, the good tired of having given everything to something that mattered. "The boy will be well," she said. "I saw," Corbin said. He was quiet for a moment. "Your people have been doing this for a long time. Since before memory," she said. He looked at her. "And it works?" "It works," she said simply. He poured the water into the trough and watched it settle.
The necklace at his chest felt warm even in the cold morning air. It began without announcement, the way important things often do. Corbin taught Nijoni to read, not because she asked exactly, but because one morning she picked up the almanac he'd left on the porch step and studied it with the focused attention of someone encountering a puzzle they intended to solve. He sat beside her and pointed to the letters, and she made no comment about whether this was a strange thing for them to be doing together. She simply learned. She was remarkably fast. Within 3 weeks, she could work through a printed page slowly, sounding out the unfamiliar words, asking questions that were never small. Why does this letter make 2 different sounds? Who decided which words get the long mark and which don't? If this is the word for water, why does it look nothing like water? He didn't always have answers. She seemed to find his uncertainty acceptable. In exchange, not as a trade exactly, but as something that naturally followed, she began teaching him Apache. Not the full language, which would have taken years he didn't have, but the words that mattered most. Water, fire, mountain, morning, danger, friend. The words for the 4 directions, each of which carried meaning beyond simple geography. East was the beginning, the sunrise, the place of new things. West was the end and the resting. North was cold and difficulty and the tests that strengthen. South was warmth and growth and the fruit of persistence. He learned the word for horse and the more specific words that described a horse's character: brave, cautious, young, proven. He learned the words for different kinds of silence: the silence before rain, the silence after danger passes, the silence of the desert at midday, which was a full and living silence and not an empty one. He learned the word for the changing woman, and he learned the word for a person who belongs to 2 worlds, a word that did not translate directly into English, but meant something like one who has learned to walk 2 paths without losing their feet. That word, he said one evening, when the lesson had moved indoors because the cold had become serious and his small fireplace was drawing them both toward it. Is that a good thing to be, walking 2 paths? Nijoni considered it. She was sitting across the table from him, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. She had developed a tolerance for the bitterness of it, though he could tell she still found it strange. The firelight was on her face, and the shadows moved slowly as the wood shifted. "It is a hard thing to be," she said, "but hard things are often good things." She looked at the steam rising from her cup. "My father walks 2 paths. He knows the old world and the new world, and he moves between them. It costs him something, but it makes him more than he would be if he only knew one." "What does it cost him?" She was quiet for a moment. "Belonging," she said. "He is too changed for the old world and too old for the new one. There is a loneliness in it." She looked up at him. "But my father says that loneliness is not the worst thing. The worst thing is to only know one world and believe that is all there is." Corbin looked at the fire. Outside, the desert wind moved against the cabin walls with the sound of something trying to find a way in. "I've been lonely out here," he said, "but this winter—" He stopped. "This winter is different," Nijoni finished. "Yes." Neither of them said anything else for a while. The fire burned down. The wind moved. Somewhere in the camp outside, someone was singing, a low, steady song that carried through the cold air like a hand extended in the dark.
The chief had been watching. He always watched. That was the quality that made him what he was. Not the capacity for action, which many men had, but the prior capacity for attention. He saw everything, and he let time tell him what it meant before he spoke. He had watched Corbin every day since his people arrived in the valley. He watched how the man moved through his work, not with the frantic energy of someone trying to prove something, but with the patient efficiency of a man who understood that the land rewarded attention over force. He watched how Corbin treated the Apache children when they wandered too close to his barn, not with the nervous hostility that most white men showed, but with a careful distance that meant, "I see you. I won't interfere with you. I'm not afraid of you." He watched how Corbin sat at the edge of the evening fires, listening without demanding, a quality the chief recognized as rare, because most people, in his experience, sat at the edges of things while planning what they would say next rather than truly hearing. And he watched how his daughter moved when Corbin was nearby. Nijoni was not a woman who showed her interior life easily. She had her mother's discipline, the ability to be fully present without being fully visible. But her father had known her since before she could walk, and he could read her the way he could read the land, by the small things, the things that didn't shout. The way she arrived at the well slightly earlier than necessary. The way she translated Corbin's words with a small delay, as if she were listening to them twice. The way she sat at the evening fires at an angle that allowed her to see both the storyteller and the man at the edge of the circle. He called her to him one morning before the camp was fully awake. They sat together inside his teepee, the small fire between them, and he spoke to her without preamble. "Tell me about this man." "You have tested him," she said. "You know what he is." "I know what he is to me and to my people," the chief said. "I want to know what he is to you." She was quiet for a long time. The fire moved between them. "He is honest," she said finally. "Not the way men are honest when they think it costs them nothing. The way a person is honest when honesty costs everything and they do it anyway. And he is learning," she said. "He comes to the evening fires and he listens. He learns our words. He watches the children and sees them as people." She paused. "He held the water bucket for 4 hours at the well last week because old grandmother Saw needed water and couldn't lift the rope. He didn't ask for thanks. He just held it." The chief watched his daughter's face while she spoke. "And?" he said again. She looked at him. "Father, I am asking." She looked at the fire. "He makes me want to stay in one place," she said quietly. "That is new for me." The chief was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low. "This is a complicated road," he said. "Our people and his people are not at peace. The world will not be kind to what you are describing." "I know." "His world will call you an enemy. Some of our people will call him one." "I know." "And still." She looked at her father without flinching. "The first woman who crossed the land from the north to the south, did she know what she would find? Did the first person who planted corn instead of gathering it know if the seed would grow? The people have always moved toward what was necessary, even when the road was not clear." The chief studied his daughter for a long time. Then he looked at the fire. "Bring him to me tomorrow evening, not for talking, for sitting. I want to see how he sits with something he doesn't understand yet."
The chief's teepee was larger than the others. Not by much. Apache culture did not value displays of status through size, but enough to hold a council of 5 or 6 people comfortably. That evening, it held the chief, 2 of his senior warriors, Nizoni and Corbin. No one explained why Corbin was there. He sat where he was gestured to sit, beside the fire, and watched. For an hour, the men spoke in Apache about Corbin couldn't follow. He caught a few words: north, soldier, winter, spring, but the substance of the discussion was beyond him. He sat and listened to the rhythm of the language and watched the faces of the men, trying to read what he could without the words. Nizoni did not translate. That, he understood, was deliberate. The chief was watching to see how Corbin handled the experience of being fully outside, of sitting in a room where everything was being decided in a language he didn't know, surrounded by people who had every reason to regard him with suspicion, asked to do nothing but be present without demanding anything from the moment. Corbin sat. He breathed. He listened to the language like music, following the rises and falls, the places where someone laughed quietly, the places where voices grew serious, the long pauses that seemed to carry as much meaning as the words around them. He watched the fire, He was, in some way he couldn't have articulated, at peace. After an hour, the chief spoke to him directly, in Apache, looking at him with those steady black eyes. Nizoni translated. My father asks, what do you think about when you cannot understand what his moves? The way people sit closer to someone they trust. The way a room feels when the people in it are trying to solve a problem together, rather than argue about it. He paused. I think about how much I don't know, and how that might be a good thing. The chief listened to the translation. Something changed in his face, not dramatically, not a smile, but a slight easing, as if a question he'd been carrying had found its answer, and he could set it down. He spoke again. Nizoni translated carefully. My father says, my daughter has told me you are learning our language. He says this is the action of a man who understands something important. That you learn a language not to use it as a tool, but because learning a language means learning how a people see the world. He says very few men outside our people have ever tried to see the world as we see it. I've barely started. He knows. That is not the point. The chief spoke one final time, and Nizoni's voice, when she translated, was careful and precise. My father says, there is a word in our language for a man who has earned the right to sit at a fire that is not his own. The word means, roughly, one who has made himself useful to the truth. He says you may be becoming that. He says time will tell. But he wants you to know he is watching with, she paused, finding the right word, with attention that is not hostile. Corbin met the chief's eyes. Tell him I am grateful, he said, and that I understand the difference between attention that is hostile and attention that means something else. The chief's eyes moved from Corbin's face to his daughter's. Nizoni was looking at the fire. A silence settled over the teepee that felt to Corbin like the silence just before rain. Charged and full and somehow certain.
Spring came to the valley in the way it always did in the high desert. Not as a gentle arrival, but as a decision. One week the ground was hard and the nights were bone cold, and then almost overnight the light changed quality. The days lengthened, and the dry creek bed on the western edge of the property ran with snowmelt from the mountains to the north. The Apache began preparing to move. The camp had the particular energy of a community in transition, purposeful and slightly melancholy, the way a good thing feels when it's ending, not because it was bad, but because time moves. Corbin worked alongside the Apache men during this time, helping to break down the teepees, load the pack horses, organize the supplies. He wasn't asked to do this. He simply appeared and began working, and the men let him, and after a while they stopped paying special attention to his presence, and that was the most natural thing that had happened since the camp arrived. On the third night before the departure, he found Nizoni at the well in the late afternoon, not filling jars, just standing, looking at the water. You're leaving in 3 days. Yes. And you'll go north, to the summer grounds. Yes. He stood beside her at the well. The evening light was long and amber, touching the canyon walls to the west and making them glow. A hawk circled above the ridge, riding a thermal with no apparent effort. I want to ask your father something, Corbin said. She looked at him. I want to ask if I can come with you, he said. Not all the way, not forever. I have land to tend, animals that need feeding. But for part of the summer, to learn, to be useful if I can. And to spend more time in your company, if that is acceptable. Nizoni was quiet for a long moment. The water in the well reflected the deepening sky. You understand what you are asking, she said. It was not a question. I'm asking to court you, he said. In whatever way is right according to your people's customs. I'm asking to do this properly,
with your father's knowledge and permission. I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give." She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze and did not look away, and tried to let her see, in the way he'd learned to let things be visible without forcing them, that he meant exactly what he said, and nothing more, and nothing less. "I will speak with my father," she said finally. "Thank you." She turned to go. Then she stopped and looked back at him over her shoulder, and the look on her face was something Corbin would carry with him for the rest of his life. Unguarded, direct, something real showing through. "He will say yes," she said quietly. "I think you already know that." Then she walked back toward the camp, tall and unhurried, her braid catching the last light.
He went with them for 6 weeks. He arranged for a neighboring rancher 2 days south to check on his animals in exchange for grazing rights on his north pasture. He packed light, 2 changes of clothes, his rifle, his knife, enough supplies to supplement what he could contribute to the community. He left the necklace visible at his throat, as he always did, because it was true, and he had decided long ago to live in ways that were true. The journey north took 4 days. He rode at the back of the column at first, then gradually, as the days passed, found himself drawn toward the middle, toward the easy conversations between the riders, the games the children played as they traveled, the way the community maintained itself in motion, each person fitting into the larger pattern, the way a river fits into its banks. He learned to make a fire Apache style. No matches, just a hand drill of the kind Nijoni had demonstrated during her coming-of-age ceremony, spinning a wooden rod between the palms until heat became coal, became flame. It took him 3 days to get it right, and when he finally held the small glowing coal in his hands and breathed it gently into flame, the satisfaction was disproportionate to the practical value of the achievement, and several of the Apache men watching grinned at him in a way that crossed every language barrier completely. He learned to read the land in Apache ways, not just the practical tracks and signs he already knew, but the deeper reading. Which plants marked underground water? Which rock formations offered reliable shelter from the specific storms of this specific landscape? Which directions the wind carried danger from, and which carried safety? The land was not backdrop in this reading. It was text. Every ridge and spring and dry wash and bird flight was information if you knew how to receive it. He watched Nijoi with the community and understood something he hadn't fully seen before. She was not just the chief's daughter. She was, in her own right, a leader, not by title, but by function. People came to her with problems. She listened, asked questions, offered the kind of counsel that helped people find their own answers, rather than substituting her judgment for theirs. She managed the complex logistics of the summer camp with an efficiency that was invisible because it looked effortless. She was, he understood, extraordinary. He told her this one evening, sitting outside the camp on a flat rock overlooking a valley that was bright green from the summer rains, the kind of green that feels like a gift in the high desert. "You say this like it is news," she said. "I knew you were remarkable from the first day I saw you," he said, "but I didn't know the shape of it. Now I do." She looked at the valley. "And what is the shape of it?" "You hold things together without making anyone feel held," he said. "That's rare. Most people who keep communities together do it through force or fear or debt. You do it through," he searched for the word, "through making people feel that their own best judgment is worth trusting." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is what my father does." "It is," he agreed.
and you do it in your own way." She turned to look at him. The evening light was on her face, and the expression there was something he had learned to read over the winter and the spring. The slight softening around her eyes that meant she was receiving something she hadn't expected and didn't know yet what to do with. "Corbin," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something. I'm listening." "When I fell during my coming-of-age walk," she said slowly, "and you gave me water, I was ashamed. Not of falling, of needing help. I had been taught that the test was about being enough alone, and I had failed it." "You didn't fail. I know that now," she said. "But I didn't know it then. What I learned afterward was something the test was never meant to teach me. That needing help is not weakness. That receiving well is also a skill. That a person who cannot accept water when they are thirsty is not strong. They are afraid." She paused. "You taught me that, without knowing you were teaching me anything." He looked at her. "You gave me more than water," she said. "I want you to know that." He reached out and took her hand, not impulsively, but with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered. She looked at their hands, then at his face. "I know," he said.
He asked the chief the old way, not as a white man asking for something, but as best he understood the Apache way, which was to present himself honestly and let the other person decide the value of what was offered. He had thought carefully about what to bring. In Apache courtship tradition, a man's family presented gifts to the woman's family, not as a purchase, but as a demonstration that he could provide, that he was serious, that he understood the exchange of value that marriage required. Corbin had no family here. He would have to speak for himself. He brought what he had. He brought 3 horses, good ones, young and well-trained, the best of his small herd. He brought salt and sugar and coffee and tools, things genuinely useful to a community that moved often and depended on reliable equipment. He brought a hand-drawn map of the territory south of the summer grounds, with water sources marked and army patrol routes noted as best he knew them, information that had direct practical value for the chief's decisions. And he brought himself, standing before the chief in the clean morning light, wearing the necklace, and he spoke without performance or apology. "I want to ask for permission to court your daughter," he said, while Nijoni translated. Not as a white man asking for property, as a man asking to be considered worthy of a partnership with someone who is, in every way that matters, better than him. He paused. "I know what I am offering is not equal to what she is. I know that I am from a different world, and that my world has done great harm to yours. I'm not asking you to forgive any of that. I'm asking only whether you see in me a man worth your daughter's time." The chief was quiet for a long time after the translation. The morning sounds of the camp moved around them. Fire and children and horses, and a particular living quiet of a place that knew what it was. When the chief finally spoke, he spoke for a long time. Nijoni translated carefully. "My father says, I have watched you since the first day you stood in your yard and did not reach for your rifle. I have watched how you move through work, like a man who respects the materials he works with. I have watched how you sit at our fires, like a man who understands that silence is also communication. I have watched how you treat the children and the old women, like people whose time has value." She paused as her father continued. He says, "I have also watched how my daughter is when you are nearby. I have watched how she speaks your name when she does not know I am listening. A father notices these things." Nijoni's voice remained steady, but Corbin could see at the edge of his vision the slight color in her face. He says, "The world between your people and mine is full of fire and blood and broken promises." He says,
He does not know if the world will allow what you are describing to exist. He says, he has spent his whole life fighting for his people's right to exist in a world that does not want them. He is tired of fighting against what is natural. She stopped and listened to the last part carefully. He says, my daughter is more than I have words for. If you take her from us, that is a loss that has no replacement. But if what you are describing is real, if you are the man I have been watching for these months, then perhaps what you are offering her is not a departure from her people, but an expansion, a new way for the people to be present in the world that is coming. The chief looked at Corbin for a long, still moment. Then he said, in English, the single English word he used for the important things, yes.
They chose the last day of summer, the last day before the community would begin moving south toward the winter grounds. The timing was not accidental. The Apache understood that beginnings and endings were the same threshold, that the most sacred moments happened at the turning of things. The preparations took 3 days. The women built a ceremonial arbor from oak branches and juniper, an open structure that let the sky in while marking the sacred space below. The floor was scattered with sage and cedar, and when the morning fire was lit, the smoke that rose was thick with the sweet, purifying scent of them. Cattail pollen, gathered from the marshes 2 days' ride east, precious and carefully stored, was prepared for the blessing that would come at the ceremony's heart. Nishone's wedding clothes had been made by the elder women over the previous weeks. Her dress was white buckskin, White Mountain Apache style, long and richly decorated, the finest hide Corbin had ever seen, tanned to a softness that seemed impossible for animal skin. The yoke and hem and sleeves were covered in intricate beadwork, turquoise and white and copper, the colors of sky and morning and the warm earth. Fringe hung from the sleeves and hem, moving with her slightest motion like the grasses in a desert wind. Around her neck, she wore the turquoise and silver she had worn the day she rode down to speak to him, months ago, in what felt like another life, and also exactly the same life, continuous. Her hair was braided with shell beads and small eagle feathers. The eagle was sacred, a messenger between the human world and the world above, a symbol of clear sight and the courage to rise. For Corbin, the women prepared something he had not expected. They made him a shirt, buckskin, like the men of the community wore, decorated at the shoulders and collar with beadwork in the same pattern as the necklace he wore, blue and white, the mark of protection, the mark of someone who faces the morning and brings warmth. He put it on in the morning with hands that were not quite steady, and when he came out of the small teepee where he had dressed and walked into the ceremonial space, the community was already gathered, forming the great circle. The circle was everything in the Apache ceremony, the fundamental form of community, the shape that said, "We are here, we witness, we hold this." 300 people formed the outer ring, and inside that ring, the ceremony would take place under the open sky. The Gan dancers came at mid-morning. 4 of them emerged from the hills, the elaborate crowns, the painted bodies, the wooden sticks clicking in their steady rhythm. They were the mountain spirits, the protectors, the bringers of blessing. They danced in the 4 directions around the ceremonial arbor, their movements carving a sacred space in the air, sanctifying the ground where the marriage would take place. The drumming began, deep and steady, the heartbeat of the land itself, and the community began to sing. Corbin stood at the eastern entrance of the arbor, east, the direction of beginnings, the direction of the sunrise, the place where new things came from. He stood very still and let the sound wash over him, and tried to be fully in the moment rather than observing it. This was something Nishone had been teaching him, in her patient, indirect way, the Apache value of presence, not planning the next thing, not cataloging the current thing, simply being in it as completely as possible, the way the land was in itself. Nishone entered from the west, the direction of endings and rest, because marriage, the tradition held, was not an ending, but a resting place, a still point in the movement of two lives from which they could see clearly. She was extraordinary. He had known this for months in every ordinary context, at the well, by the fire, in conversation, in the quiet spaces between words. But here, in her ceremonial clothes, moving through the circle of her community's love and attention, she was something beyond what he had words for. Tall and straight, her dark eyes finding his across the ceremonial space with the directness that simply, essentially, was who she was. The medicine man blessed them both with cattail pollen. The pale yellow dust brushed across their foreheads, their lips, their joined hands. In Apache tradition, cattail pollen was the breath of life, the substance of blessing, the connection between the human body and the growing world. To be blessed with it was to be made part of the ongoing story of living things. There was no formal exchange of vows in words. The Apache ceremony did not require verbal promises. What was being witnessed by the community was not a promise, but a fact, a reality being recognized. The circle of 300 people, the gone dancers' blessing, the pollen on their hands, all of it said, "We see this. It is real. It belongs to the world now." The chief stood at the eastern edge of the circle, watching. His face, as always, was difficult to read. But when Corbin looked at him and held his gaze for a moment, the old man gave the slightest nod. The same nod he had given the day he said the test was over, the day Corbin had passed into something the chief considered worth knowing. It was enough. They performed the exchange of gifts, Corbin offering the carved wooden box he had spent the winter making, inside which he had placed a letter he had written, and Nishoni had helped him translate into Apache, saying what he felt in words that would exist in both their languages. Nishoni gave him a basket woven from summer grasses, decorated with a design she had spent weeks creating, a pattern that, she explained quietly as she placed it in his hands, was her own design, invented for the occasion, combining Apache geometric forms with a motif she had taken from the title page of the almanac, a rising sun over an open horizon. The feast lasted until after dark. There was venison and corn and acorn stew and bread baked in the ground. There was dancing, not ceremony now, but celebration, the community's joy finding its natural form in movement and music. Children ran between the fires. The old women sat together and talked, sometimes looking at Corbin and Nishoni with expressions ranging from amused to approving to quietly satisfied. The gone dancers returned at midnight for a final blessing, their crowns catching the firelight, their movements protective and fierce and beautiful, and then withdrew into the darkness from which they had come.
Epilogue. What remains? The years that followed were not simple. The world between the Apache people and the settlers did not make peace because two people had. The army kept coming. The pressures on the Apache lands kept growing. There were seasons when the chief's band was forced to move faster and further than any of them wanted, and seasons when the patrols came close enough to the valley that Corbin kept watch through the nights and Nishoni sat beside him in the dark, her hand in his, both of them listening. The militia leader, the bearded man, never came back with violence, but other men came, with papers and surveyor's tools, and the particular confidence of people who believed that documentation created reality. Corbin fought them through the legal channels available to him, with limited success, and learned something in the process, that the system he'd believed in was not as honest as he had wanted it to be, and that this, too, was a kind of falling, a kind of moment where you could lie down and stay down, or get up and move on. He got up. Nishoni built a second structure on the property, not quite a teepee, not quite a cabin, but something between the two, with Apache proportions and organization inside, and solid timber walls outside. It faced east. The smoke hole at the top was a proper one, not a chimney. The herbs drying inside it were the ones she had learned from her grandmother. They had 2 children, a girl first, tall even as an infant, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's quietness, and then a boy who had everyone's stubbornness in approximately equal measure and kept them both occupied. The chief visited every winter and every summer. He grew older in the way that men who have lived at the full scale of their capacities grow older, not diminishing, but deepening, each year adding to what he was rather than subtracting from it. He sat at Corbin's table and at Nishone's fire with equal ease and spoke of the world's troubles with the patient sorrow of a man who had seen everything and was still, somehow, not finished seeing. Corbin kept the necklace. He wore it every day, visible on his chest as he always had. Some people who passed through understood what it meant. Some people didn't and decided what they wanted to decide about it, and Corbin long ago stopped trying to explain himself to people who had already decided what they thought. He was past the age of needing to be understood by everyone. It was enough to be understood by the people who mattered. On evenings when the light was long and the valley was the particular gold that it became in autumn, he would sit on the porch of the cabin and watch the land. Nishone would be beside him or inside with the children, or riding the ridge with the sure-footed ease she had always had in the saddle. The sounds of the desert evening would move around them. Somewhere far away, the Apache people were doing what they had always done, moving through the land, reading it, living in the conversation with it that no fence line or deed had ever been able to fully interrupt. He had given water to a girl who needed it. That was all. That was everything. The rest, the love, the ceremony, the children, the long life of learning that followed. The rest was what the land gave back when you understood that what you put into it did not disappear. Water flows downhill. It finds the places where it is needed. And sometimes, if you are paying attention, it finds you.